Hello, and welcome to the January 9th edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle weekly meeting. Today, we're going to start with some follow-up from last week. We had a number of action items from last week's meeting, and I wanted to go over those and sort of see where we're at. So the first couple were assigned to me. The first one was to add more people to our GitHub teams. And so we agreed during the last meeting that everybody who's a code owner should also be in the GitHub teams. So I went through and added everyone in the kubeadm owners file to the GitHub teams. There was also a list of folks that Lucas had proposed to join the teams sort of on an opt-in basis, which was Ilya, Lee, Sergey, and Ryan. And I did not automatically add those people, but if your name is on that list and you'd like to be on the GitHub teams, you can let me know and I will add you, or you can ask to be added to the teams and I will approve your membership request. I also put a note in the doc that I removed Mike Denise as a reviewer / approver from the kubeadm owners file. Tim had a question about why. It's because Mike has not been active on the project for a while. And I think we should try to keep that file sort of up to date with people that are currently working on the project, doing reviews and contributing. So sort of a cleanup task. So the second one was Lucas pointed to a markdown file that we have that was previously a page on our wiki that was quite out of date, and basically asked if there was anything on there that we thought we should save. And I read through it, and there's actually some interesting bits on there. Brian wrote that quite a while back, and some of the stuff is still applicable. And I think what we should try to do is take that and combine it with our 2018 roadmap doc that Lucas put together. Both the markdown doc and Lucas's doc have sort of a set of upcoming work items, things we think we're going to tackle in the future, with links to lots of different GitHub issues. I think that's pretty valuable for people if they're sort of looking at what our SIG does. And so I think we should combine those two things, put them in Markdown and link to it from our SIG page in the community repo. So I haven't had a chance to take a pass at doing that. If anybody is interested, it would be great to grab a volunteer to do that. Otherwise, I'll throw it on my backlog and probably get to it in a month. So the next one was we had a number of things we were talking about for 110. This kind of falls into the 110 planning. One of them was Matt was going to go talk to SIG off about graduating TLS Bootstrap to GA in 1.10. I don't know if Matt is here or if SIG off has had a meeting since we last met, but I wanted to sort of keep poking at that and see if that was the plan of record for 110.
Last I heard it was, and it was pretty non-controversial. I don't know if Joe wants to chime in there, but I think everyone that I heard from was the general consensus was yes.
Yeah, I'm supportive. I think we're in good shape.
Excellent. I don't think I've seen Lucas on the call, but Lucas had volunteered to start the process for culling the Getting Started guides. And I think he might have actually volunteered Ilya. And I did see Ilya on the call, so maybe Ilya can give an update here. Just to reiterate, the plan is to announce to people who have Getting Started guides on the website that right after the 1.10 release, we are going to delete any Getting Started guides that are not that don't have the Kubernetes certification mark, which basically gives people about 3 months to get the certification mark if they want to keep their guide up to date. And so we thought that was pretty fair warning for folks. And then right after 110 ships, we'll go through and delete all the rest of them. And this should give us a pretty good first pass at deleting a bunch of stale Getting Started guides. In the meantime, I also was poking at, we have this URL that's been around for a long time, get.k8s.io, which basically downloads the kubeup bash script and then runs it for you. The intent is to, to curl pipe to bash to install Kubernetes, which was really, really cool, 4 or 5 years ago, and is terribly insecure. We shouldn't be telling people to run curl pipe to bash. We have lots of other tools to install Kubernetes, and this doesn't really work on very many platforms anymore. So I've been slowly trying to figure out where this is used and get rid of it and clean up our documentation around it. Right now, it's the only remaining place, unless people are actually using it, is in some of our test infrastructure. So I'm working with the engprod team here at Google to try and sort of rip out references to it there, at which point I'll send Tim Hawken a PR to delete the link on k8s.io.
Robert, but like, what about server logs? Like, is there what sort of diversity of client IPs do we see in the server logs, or is that possible to look at it? Something like that. I don't know.
For the gets a URL.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the problem with that URL is back when we were adding more platform support to KubeUp, you could tell like, oh, people are launching on AWS, people are launching on GCP, people are launching it on Rackspace or Photon or wherever else we were adding support. And over the last couple of releases, we've been ripping out all those different pieces of support. So AWS got pulled out, 3 or 4 releases ago. Mike Denise made a pass and cleaned up a bunch of other stale parts of KubeUp. And so the surface area of KubeUp is shrinking. And I'm not sure it's sort of relevant to see what any sort of data about what our install base might look like.
No, just in case, just to answer the question if anybody's
look for
using
usage.
Yeah, just if anybody's using it really that we are not aware of.
That's a good question. I'll ask Tim, since he seems to be our de facto webmaster. All those logs. I think we need to take it out of our testing first because it's going to make the logs really messy.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah,
it's going to come from a whole bunch of different GCP IPs. I don't want to have to try to filter those out. And then Tim, you've got one on here for the backlog. I saw you sent an email yesterday that said expect a whole bunch of issue updates. How's that coming?
So there's 2 parts to this that I would like a partner. So I'm soliciting people who want to get involved in the SIG and who are particularly interested in understanding the state space of the backlog, right? Because there's a lot of it. There's 2 parts. One is the kubeadm repo, and the second is the main repository. What I'm asking for help in, because anyone in the main repository can label, is to go through, and I can supply a set of queries, to go through those set of queries and to try to assign relative priority to some of them, or just poke me if you have questions, and to try and either close them out, get rid of them, or get them on the radar for the next release cycle as we do our planning. There is a fairly substantial long list of them in the main repository. I will go through the kubeadm repo because I have rights there, so I can just update and add the labels appropriately. But ideally, what I'd like to do is have a set of like P1 and P0 items that we agree to and can federate out to the SIG. And folks who are new to the SIG, as we have, I don't know how many people on this, 33 people on this call, which is a lot of people, they can take any of the help wanted items and we can, as long as there is a reviewer for it, we can help get that, burned down. Because there's a lot of finagly things that require addressing, and we would love community involvement there. We'd also love if you want to be, build up committership rights or sort of maintainer rights, that we'd love to help guide those folks through the process and help grow the SIG, not just as a group of people who are interested in it, but a group of maintainers that are help collaborate on the effort. So you can either sign up now if you want to in the doc, or feel free to ping me on the Slack channel.
So Ilya commented in the doc that he's happy to help. So I don't think other people should take that as a sign that they shouldn't help as well. Like I think Tim is looking for at least one partner here, not exactly one partner. And I think we can certainly shard the work across multiple people. So thank you, Ilya, for volunteering. But other people, don't let that stop you from volunteering as well. So I think that was all of the follow-ups from last week. A couple of them have additional follow-ups we'll want to do in the weeks going forward. But I wanted to make sure we didn't lose track of the things that people had signed up for. So next, we had an action from, or an agenda item last week for Walter to give us an update from the cloud provider working group, which we didn't get to because Walter wasn't here, but Walter I see on the line today. And I think, Walter, you had talked to Lucas about this at some point in the past. And he might have
yes.
specific things he wanted to hear from you. He's not here today, but the rest of us will do our best to try and ask questions for you.
Well, the good news is Lucas is actually up to date on most of this. He's part of the working group. So he knows everything I'm about to say, but I think he wanted it shared with the SIG. So one, there's an effort to get rid of all of the cloud providers out of the main repo. So there are 7 cloud providers in repo today, and by the time the working group is done with their work, we'd like to get all of the cloud providers out. The thought process is sort of the Linux model of having a Kubernetes kernel and then having cloud provider distributions of the Kubernetes core. So towards getting that done, there is a KEP. It's a rough draft right now, but it's been approved by several people. So we're just sort of waiting for it to become an official KEP. But you can see the rough draft. It's under the cloud provider breakout working groups area until it becomes an official KEP. There's a couple of large pieces involved in this. The first is that we're trying to separate the kube controller manager so that all of the
Turbo.
sorry, heard something.
Turbo.
I'm not sure what that turbo is.
Meme not mute. Apologize.
No worries. So we're trying to break the kube controller manager into two pieces, the kube controller manager and the cloud controller manager. Hopefully starting in 110, that'll be something that you can do in all cloud providers, but it'll still be in tree. Within a few releases, probably 3 or 4, we'd like to get to the point where the cloud controller manager is completely broken out of Kubernetes core and is being run only in the distros. So there are several things involved in that. One is certain things like IP management needs to be run in Kube Controller Manager unless you're running it in distro. And so we're looking at things like the config system to be able to make sure that that particular controller is running in exactly one controller manager. And it's one of the motivations I have for going to the new component config, is I'm hoping that that'll make it easier to solve that particular problem. It does mean that which controllers are running may vary depending on the cloud distro. It also means that we need to make sure that anything we want to run in Kube Controller Manager does not have calls to cloud provider. So there's some interesting things going on right now having to do with that. One is that we've taken Node and the Node controller and we've broken it into currently 2 pieces, the IP management and the Node Lifecycle. The idea is that the IP management will be running in the cloud controller manager and the lifecycle would run in the Kube controller manager. There's still a little more work to be done on that front because there's still one cloud call remaining in the cloud controller manager, or sorry, the Node lifecycle controller. One of the big other pieces in the background is volumes. So we're working closely with SIG storage on trying to get CSI working because that's how we believe we can get all of the lifecycle stuff, not lifecycle, all of the cloud calls out of Kube Controller Manager that have anything to do with volume. So that's sort of a high-level view. The other thing is that I'm trying to unify the infrastructure behind the controller managers. So API Machinery today has this concept of a generic API server. I would like to have the concept of a generic controller manager, and then every cloud provider has the ability to make use of that to make their cloud controller manager, and it would also be the core controller manager code, framework code that runs the Kube controller manager. So there's a lot of work to be done there. There's also a lot of work to be done in things like KubeUp, because if you look, a huge amount of what KubeUp actually does is called cloud provider specific code. So the thought process is that eventually all of that sort of infrastructure for bringing up a cluster is going to get moved out of core repo and moved into the individual cloud providers. And probably we'd end up with the only thing that actually needed to be in tree is something that allowed you to run Kubernetes on your local machine. So happy to answer any questions about any of that. If people have feedback, we'd love to hear it.
There are some constraints inside of the scheduler that I'm aware of, with regards to EBS volumes and number of attachments and stuff, which is very cloud provider specific. It's kind of glue logic as it exists today. Ideally, I would like that stuff to also be ripped out if possible. I don't know if anyone has thought about that.
I'm not sure anyone has. Good news from my perspective is I sit next to Bobby Salamat, who is one of the scheduler guys. So I'll spend some time today and go bug him on this issue. So thank you for bringing that up.
Great.
So one of the, and I'm trying to understand if this is a concern or not. One of the things that I think has helped kubeadm get traction is we've separated out this idea of running the cluster and sort of everyday operation of the cluster with the interaction with the cloud provider for sort of provisioning and creating nodes and that type of stuff. And so I just want to make sure that as we break this stuff out, I'm able to sort of say use the, ELB, cloud provider specific stuff without having to use, say, the Amazon specific stuff for provisioning nodes, right? Are we thinking about keeping these things separate so that users can mix and match the logical pieces that they want, integrations they want to use, and integrations that they don't want to use? I think another example might be Ingress. Folks have a lot of opinions about Ingress. It's a cloud provider specific things in some cases, but I may want to use my own Ingress system instead of using the cloud provider integrated Ingress system. So are you looking at these things as a mix and match type of thing, or as an all or nothing type of thing?
More of a mix and match. And to be specific, I mean, what we'd really like to do is minimize the amount of stuff we move out. Our goal here, for instance, the reason why Lifecycle, the node Lifecycle isn't being moved out because it has a cloud call in it, is because we feel like the majority of that the majority of node Lifecycle we'd like to make consistent across Kubernetes. We'd like to keep that as a Kubernetes core concept. And so, obviously when someone like Red Hat or Google or Azure takes Kubernetes out, they're going to, since it's a distro and they can write wrappers around it, they can modify it somewhat, but we'd like to make sure that we have core concepts that are part of this. This is also why we're working with things like the compliance team to make sure that we have the right set of compliance tests so that the right set of concepts about how one runs Kubernetes remain, so that you have some, reason to believe that what you're doing for your system will work on any Kubernetes system.
So one comment you made there concerns me a little bit, is that you said that, there's distributions and so they can do what they want with this stuff. The idea of a distribution is not something that's like official with Kubernetes, and personally I'd like to see us minimize the idea of a distribution and make sort of upstream work in and of itself. And I think one of the things that we've seen with, say, the AWS cloud provider is that it was sort of co-developed with COPS. And so it's difficult to use that AWS cloud provider outside of COPS just because the documentation and the testing, it wasn't sort of viewed as a separable thing. I think some of the Google integrations are in a similar position, where because of the, the sort of co-development around GKE, there's not a lot of great documentation about how you use those things, absent the structure that's built up around them. And so I think, as we should be thinking about cloud providers as something that exists outside of the various mechanisms that are used to configure.
I agree. And so one of the things we would love help on is working out the right way to make the balance. Obviously, for the cloud providers, they want a certain amount of control. When they break something, they want to be able to rev quickly so that they can get it fixed. One of the problems that all of the in-tree systems have today is when they pull in the new distro and then try and push it, they discover it's broken, and suddenly they're trying to force a faster than normal OSS point release. We'd love to be able to fix that. At the same time, to your point, we'd like to make sure that we're not fragmenting what Kubernetes means. And toward that, there's a couple of things, but more are welcome. One, as I mentioned, is the compliance tests. another, we'd like to see if we can make sure that all of the, what I've been calling the distros are actually still Kubernetes projects owned by CNCF, presumably primarily personed by the relevant cloud provider, but there's nothing that says that the Google, the Google Kubernetes distro, or whatever we decide we want to call it, is all Google engineers, right? In fact, I think it would probably be healthy if there remain a few outside people who can look at it and keep us or AWS or Microsoft or Red Hat honest about what we're doing.
There is a piece.
Go ahead, Tim.
There's a piece of the puzzle that has not been fully vetted with regards to what Dennis Williams has been calling conformance profiles, and that relates to cloud provider layers of support with certification. I kind of think as a graduation criteria, as we start to unify these pieces out of tree, that should probably be a requirement. So that way, if people slap together these pieces, they have a way of guaranteeing that this cloud-based storage is, tested adequately within their environment, because otherwise you get the drift of behavior that will happen, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And in fact, one of the things that's sort of unfortunate is, we have these conformance tests, and that's a great start. But when I look through a large number of our integration tests, I see, there's this very common line of code that I see, which says, if not GCE, skip, right? So there's definitely a lot of work. And there's also, from our side, there's a lot of work being put in, not only to get rid of a lot of those sort of problems where it says, hey, this test does only run on GCE, but also, how do we push code changes out to the various cloud providers, and then how do we gather the results in, and what are the expectations, and if changes happen, how often do those tests get run, right? I mean, someone has to pay for them.
Well, that's part of the conformance working group. I think the only requirement I'm stipulating is that as we start to graduate these pieces, that there is an adequate set of tests that's cloud provider agnostic, that can be enabled according to the spec, which is not fully formed yet, but has been articulated many times about having cloud provider layers.
Yeah. No, agreed. And I mean, one of the things going on when I talk to the conformance tests guys, because I mean, we're trying to work with them to make this happen. Right now, the last time I talked with them, there's sort of at least an unofficial view that the primary set of tests they're concerned with are GA features, which is a little awkward when I think most SIGs get things to beta and stop.
That is a fair assessment, and it is a true assessment, but it is also a little sad.
No argument, but it's something we've got to look at and solve.
So I don't. My concern, just like rewinding a little bit, is I don't want us to use the idea of a distribution as a crutch to make up for the fact that we don't have documentation, that we don't have testing. We shouldn't let the tail wag the dog, right? The distributions shouldn't be the ones driving what these integrations look like. They should be something that's layered strictly on top of the integrations. And so we shouldn't, we should look to avoid sort of that sort of, unhealthy symbiotic relationship that can form between the sort of install mechanisms, distributions, whatever you want to call them, and the cloud providers. And I also think it's somewhat unrealistic for us to assume that every mechanism for installing Kubernetes is going to be owned by CNCF. I think that it's just the reality is that there's going to be a huge amount of diversity there. Our goal with Cluster Lifecycle is not to try and bring every way of installing Kubernetes into one sort of, framework, but instead provide a toolbox so that we can, organically create as much commonality as possible across these things. So I think that the cloud provider should be a similar type of thing. Let's provide a toolbox that starts to rein in the amount of drift in a more natural, organic way.
I completely agree. I mean, let me just be clear. I completely agree. And I mean, 2 points on that. One, we already have cloud providers outside CNCF, Rancher, and a few others. So, I mean, it's not we have things outside, right? That's the truth today. The other thing is, this is why I worry about things like generic controller manager, because I'd like the controller managers working in a consistent way. And yeah, it's from my perspective, it's part of that toolbox. If you guys have ideas of tools we can provide to help things remain consistent, that's great. I mean, like, tell us about it. Let's see what we can do. Yeah.
So I mean, you know, again, the conformance stuff is definitely going to be a big part of this, and I think identifying the different types of integrations and really keeping those separate. So you can say, okay, you have a persistent volume integration. Okay, so if you have the persistent volume integration, that means that you're going to be able to pass these conformance tests when everything is said and done. That's separate from having a, you know, service type equals load balancer integration. That's separate, you know, and so trying to keep these things as separate, because I think another thing is that we say cloud providers, but in reality, you may have a Hitachi storage array, which is providing your persistent volume stuff, and sort of, you know, an F5 load balancer that's, you know, providing your load balance, and you have different integrations for those. And in that scenario, you're definitely much more in a mix and match type of thing, and it doesn't sort of fit the more traditional sort of like I'm running on Amazon or I'm running on GC or what have you type of thing.
Yep.
So they're the opposite concern, though, is if you break each one of those out into a separate binary, a separate Docker container, then you have a huge number of things to manage and a lot of overhead from running all of those as separate processes. I think one of the things Walter mentioned earlier, which is really interesting, is using component configuration to sort of toggle controllers on and off. And we use this to move controllers out of the generic controller into the Cloud Controller Manager, but it should also allow you to run the Cloud Controller Manager with a subset of functionality. That you should put the Cloud Controller Manager and say, I just want the service part of the controller, not the volume part of the controller.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be critical for things like managing rate limits with Amazon, right? Because if you have all these separate binaries and they're not coordinated in terms of, you know, how hard they're hammering the AWS API, you're going to get throttled pretty quickly. So, yeah.
This discussion kind of leads into a DAG of execution. And I know we're going to talk about 110 planning next. And I know one of the items is with regards to component config for the controller manager. So I just wanted to make sure that we touch that a little bit and kind of realize that this is going to cross many areas.
I would like to say, I think our goal for the Kubernetes project should be to get Kubernetes adopted and create a great experience for our users. I don't think we should express it in terms of inside baseball, right? It should not be about the ability, you know, the structure of the project. It should be about how do we get everyone in the world using Kubernetes and loving using Kubernetes. And we might say that our strategy is to do things like kubeadm, but we shouldn't make a goal of having a large number of installers. If Google releases the best installer in the world, or if Heptio releases the best installer in the world, that is a win, right? It is not a loss to the project.
Well, I mean, there's some subtlety here, Justin. I think ideally we would get to the point where everybody agrees that, hey, this is the way things are done and we don't have a ton of diversity and there's clarity for users. I don't think that we necessarily are going to get there by anointing something. And so how do we organically sort of provide the right incentives over time so that essentially the one true installer emerges for a particular scenario? And I think that has to be from a level of sort of like, you know, grounds up, provide a toolkit and then let things emerge, versus trying to say we're going to create the end all be all installer project, which I don't have confidence that's going to be effective.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just, it is a question of tactics on how to get there, but I don't want it to be an explicit goal that we encourage an ecosystem of installers. The explicit goal should be the success of Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And you might argue, right? I'm sure you're going to argue that the success of Kubernetes requires an ecosystem of installers, but I think I just want to make that distinction.
Right. Looks like we're sort of wrapping up the discussion with Walter. Are there any other questions about the cloud provider progress, how that might dovetail with, you know, kubeadm or the cluster API, any other things that are on people's mind while we've got Walter on the line? All right. Thank you so much for joining, Walter. You are free to hang around for the next part, although it may not be of extreme interest to you. But that was very helpful. Thanks so much. So next on the list, I have 110 planning. It might be worthwhile, Tim put GA list on there below that. I think we touched on the GA for kubeadm last week. It might be worthwhile doing that first before we do 110 planning. So let me find the link for that. Here it is. I'll drop that to the notes. I assume you mean kubeadm, Tim.
Yeah, I don't think we've broader. This is probably one of the larger groups post-holiday to have, you know, squatting on the call. So I think, you know, soliciting feedback from this broader group about what things they consider to be requirements for kubeadm to be GA, I think is a worthwhile topic for discussion. I know you, me, and Lucas have bantered about it, and we've wanted to solicit the broader ecosystem, but now I think is a good time to mainly, you know, iterate the high points that people think are requirements for graduation to GA.
Do you want to walk us through the list? We can discuss the bullets and then see if people think there's things missing. I think that's the thing I'm most concerned about, is that there are things that aren't on this list that people strongly feel are blockers.
Yeah, the first one is dynamic kubelet configuration. That's going to be moving to beta. I thought it missed the 1.9 cycle at the end for beta. And does that have to be GA before we can actually announce GA? Or does it just have to be defaulted in our configuration?
I think Lucas was hoping that it would be beta so that we could use that to configure kubelets, because it would make our support and upgrade story easier going forward.
Yes.
Toppin responded to the comment there, because I think from our side, we were thinking that it just barely missed 1.9. But a small piece of it barely missed 1.9. But he says the overall feature he thinks will be roughly mid-February, which to me means risky for 110, right?
Okay. But that's a reasonable requirement, because we don't want, in the long term, we don't want to be maintaining argument updates over the long haul. We want to bootstrap initially and then let the cluster arguments be revved as any internal API is.
Right. Although this, if we block on that, we may again miss 1.10 release cycle for GA because we're blocked on the node team. Right.
So I understand that the requirements of people wanting to push things to GA, and please, people in the call, please chime up, is that we get feedback from the community where people ask, well, I would use this if it was GA. Is that a blocker for you using kubeadm or not? Because kubeadm has been in beta for quite some time, right? And it's been a long tail beta cycle. But I don't know if it's legitimately blocking some people, or if it's kind of a, you know, a statement that people anecdotally make from time to time.
And we heard from some specific users at KubeCon that it was blocking their companies from adopting kubeadm. I don't know if
Yeah, I think
would dial into this call or not, though.
Yeah, I think enterprises won't. Some enterprises have policies that they actually. I know some enterprises have policies that they will not adopt beta software. They just won't touch it, and that's their corporate policy. I think outside of large enterprises that have policies like that, I don't think it would readily stop anything, because kubeadm has been around for so long. But
yeah, I think we've been erring on the side of caution, which isn't a bad thing, on our promotions for sub-elements as well as promotion of kubeadm itself. We just want to make sure that we don't prematurely promote kubeadm or configuration of it, and we're actually getting good feedback and doing the right thing by our users. I don't know if Google has any like survey apparatus, but I think this is kind of one of those spaces where a community survey would be a useful thing.
Yeah, I mean, Brennan used to send out surveys, just using sort of Google Forms. The question is how to reach the right audience, right? Like if we just send it out to Kubernetes dev or Kubernetes users, is that going to touch the people that we think are blocked? Because as Chris said, if you're not working at a large enterprise, a lot of people are already using kubeadm.
That's true. I don't think it hurts, but I don't think we're going to hit the release. I don't think we're going to hit GA in the next cycle. So I think slow rolling this and getting a survey out, I think would be a worthwhile effort. So that way we can at least make sure that we have the bits that people would like in a GA release when we say we're GA and we're supporting them. I can go on to the next item in the list. I don't know if we want to record that in the main meeting notes. The next one was dynamic kubelet serving certs to beta. I think that's uncontroversial. We also mentioned bootstrap tokens to GA. That I think is pretty uncontroversial. I did see that Lee, is that how you pronounce your name? Had put the TLS secure local endpoint. And not any master can write to etcd, only root. That PR was put up. I have a window of PRs to go through and review, and I also talked to Moyer about that one this morning too. Make kubeadm kubelet drop-in generic, not specific version. I don't exactly know what that one means.
The drop-in, the systemd drop-in unit, because the kubelet systemd unit that comes in your RPM or DAP package doesn't actually pass any arguments. So it's like start kubelet with its default arguments, and kubeadm overrides that with bunch arguments, basically.
Oh, that kind of fits with the dynamic kubelet configuration, though.
Yeah. But don't you need dynamic kubelet configuration flag or something?
Yes, you would need to enable that, and you would need the config map to be specified. I kind of see this underneath that area.
Still, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. I think I wasn't sure what this meant until Ilya explained it. So the drop-in here is code that we run when we're installing the package, right? That's the generic drop-in part.
So I think what's been. Let me just look at the context in the docs. Did we say it is to do with the drop-in unit being version dependent at the moment, right? Okay. Oh yeah, it's the GA list. It's yeah. Drop in. Oh yeah, it's make kubeadm kubelet drop-in generic, not minor version specific. Okay, so yeah, so so essentially the kubelet flags we've been setting have evolved in every version, right? That's what this says, and they want to make it generic using dynamic. Oh yeah, so it says consequence of using dynamic configuration.
Well, I know we are probably given the feedback we have so far, I think we are not likely to hit GA in the 110 cycle, and I know that Robert wanted to get to the 110 backlog or priorities for this cycle. I think what makes a lot of sense is to send out the survey or have folks who are on the call review that GA list to ensure sanity, and we can ping it periodically to make sure we're hitting the mark. So that way, when we reevaluate for 111, we can get consensus by that time frame to determine what features we would absolutely like to have for GA release. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah.
Right. I think we, instead of us going through the rest of the details there, we can punt to the list and survey and go on to the 110 planning. Unless there's objections.
For the folks on the call, even before we send out the survey, are there things that are not on this list that you think should be? So the one thing we kind of skimmed over was at the bottom of this list, it says non-goals. And in particular, kubeadm sort of doing HA seamlessly out of the box, we've said is at this point a non-goal for marking what we have today, GA. I think there was some contention about this at the contributor summit in KubeCon, because during the contributor summit, Lucas had a whiteboard and was taking a list from people of what they thought should be in GA, and HA was near the top of that list. Since then, I think we've been kind of coming around a little bit and trying to sort of really decide, if that should be a blocker.
And to be clear, this is out of the box friendly kubeadm specific version. You can do HA today. There's many flavors of it, and there's even several documented guides and installers for it. But this is an out of the box experience.
Yeah, and in particular, an out-of-the-box experience that doesn't require you to do things like touch a cloud provider to set up a load balancer, right? Which makes things a lot more complicated.
I think it seems reasonable because, addressing the masters when you have a set of them is not a solved problem. Figuring out how to distribute secrets and swizzle those around is not a sort of one-size-fits-all problem. I don't think that we can achieve sort of the simplicity that we want without making some less than optimal decisions in terms of how we actually get this stuff done.
Yeah, and I mean, we shouldn't conflate easy and GA, right? Some features in GA version could be still like not exactly the easiest ones, and I think the previous point is quite similar to that. It's like certain like upgrades, slightly complicated, but GA, and like if we solve the kubelet flag dynamic configuration issue, that's great. But if that sort of lags behind, then then it's not a big deal if it's just a little complicated to upgrade. It could still be GA as long as it works, right?
But maybe that's one answer here. Maybe what we can say is that kubeadm does support HA. But it just requires sort of extra manual steps, right? So it's supported, it's GA, it's something that'll work, but it's just not easy. Technically it's there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the tricky part around that, Joe, comes in when we say we support HA, and then we say, here's the kubeadm upgrade command. And if you've done some extra steps to make HA work, then that may not just work when you need the next version of Kubernetes. Like you're going to have to do something a little bit extra each time you upgrade probably as well. I think that might be a confusing user experience.
I think to some degree, if we have the right documentation and the tool set works within that documentation, then it's supported and it can be GA. We really need to be viewing that documentation, those upgrade guides as part of the product, not as sort of a separate thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
That being said, I think, going to GA, and having the HA support be marked beta with those documentation, that seems reasonable also.
Yeah, there were a number of things that Lucas had said we should probably just call beta even if the tool itself is GA. And so there'll be a number of sort of ways to use a tool where you're only using GA parts of the tool. And if you use a tool with certain flags or certain features, gates turned on, then you are using alpha or beta pieces of functionality within that tool. And that's pretty consistent with other parts of Kubernetes and other CLI tools and so forth, right?
I think the only constraint there, though, is if we have upgrades by default within kubeadm, we need to at least have the documentation path clean for HA upgrades as well. Namely, the etcd side is going to be the thorny one, right?
And I think it also might be worthwhile, and this might be a feature that we want to add, is that if you do something non-standard, there's a way to actually mark that config map that says, hey, I did something non-standard, and sort of pop out and say, hey, I want to do a -- force or something like that to actually move forward, so that people don't have this illusion that they can just call upgrade and have it work once they've sort of gone off the rails.
Yeah,
what are the things that we think will break if someone had an HA cluster, had set up, done the manual steps, and then did a kubeadm upgrade? What do we think is actually going to happen?
If it's all self-hosted, it actually works pretty seamlessly and clean, except for the etcd portion, which will require explicit configuration based upon how you've set up and installed etcd, because we support multiple ways of doing that. With the documented one that Jamie has created, we would have to go across and do an explicit, modification to the manifest to roll in the new versions. And we'd also want to make a couple of documented things beforehand, clean and clear, like back up your cluster before you do this, warning, type of thing.
But do you mean for a version of Kubernetes that recommends a new version of etcd? Or is it
Well, it revs. Almost every single revision that I've ever worked on has revved the version of etcd with Lifecycle. So making sure that we match the version that's been gone through the full qualification procedures, I think, is useful.
All right, we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to switch us over to the next topic, which is the 110 planning doc that Tim alluded to earlier. So it's linked from the meeting notes. I'll also drop a link to it into chat. So basically what I did is I took the 1.9 planning doc, copied it over, rejiggered priorities a little bit based on what I believe people have sort of already committed to working on for this release cycle, and based on sort of conversations we've been having. And what I'd like to do is to go over that and see if there are things that are not on here that people are sort of signing up to do during this release cycle. And B, if people think that as a SIG, if we're not focusing our efforts on the right thing, I think that would also be good feedback as well. So at the top of the doc, I put the cluster API work that we're driving. We have a lot of people at Google working on this. We have some somewhat aggressive goals here. We have a breakout meeting on Wednesdays, and we have a lot of community interest and a lot of folks that are starting to contribute code. I keep getting pinged by new people that see the talk that Chris and I gave at KubeCon, or stumble across some of our documentation and say, hey, we've been working on a very similar project. How do we work together? Which is great, because I think, as sort of as Joe was saying earlier, with some of the cloud provider code, there's a lot of code out there that does sort of this infrastructure provisioning bit stuff, and the more that we can create some shared libraries and shared APIs, I think that'll be better for the community. And again, we don't want to mandate it, but as people are sort of voluntarily coming together and saying we think it'd be great to sort of work on something common, we're going to keep pushing forward on that. So what I've written down there is we want to have a solid alpha API. We sort of have an alpha API as of the end of last year, but we want to sort of solidify that with multiple implementations underneath to sort of vet that the API is working. And we want to add sets on top of the machines that we have so far. So the next one I put is the component config work. And this is really sort of working with other SIGs to try and convince them to move over. Lucas and I talked quite a bit at KubeCon about how sort of the lack of progress here is starting to block some of our efforts, both within kubeadm and the cluster API, in terms of creating sort of good ways for users to configure their cluster. And I know that Justin put in our SIG's mission statement that we should be driving this across the project. And I think I've narrowed down the list of other SIGs and the list of components I think we should really be pushing on here. Just as sort of the control, the core control pieces of the cluster, basically things that kubeadm installs, and not, we shouldn't be spending our time going and talking, to the folks that write Heapster and trying to convince them to switch over until we've gotten the core parts of the system switched over first. So kubelet is in flight. Michael Toffin is pushing on that already, so we don't need to do too much there to sort of encourage progress. I think the scheduler is in pretty good shape. Tim, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. kubeproxy has had some work done on it. I don't think kubeDNS has, but kubeDNS is something we also install by default with kubeadm. I guess we're switching to core DNS. Maybe I should change that to core DNS at this point. And then Walter just talked about both the kube controller manager and the cloud controller manager. So sort of the big hole I see here is the API server. itself and how we want to configure the API server going forward.
Well, just to be clear, the controller manager isn't done. There's no one signing up to execute on that bit. So having folks who can work on that, I can help review it and guide you through the examples that exist for the proxy and the scheduler. I know Andy had blazed the path there, but I know he's busy with other things. If there are folks who can step up in the controller manager space, the API server area, I think, will be much thornier because there's all kinds of security constraints and everything else that goes along with it. So I'm not, I would recommend any volunteers have a good foot in SIG auth before they start to go into component config for the API server.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I know that Walter talked about how he sort of sees that as something he can use to help separate the Cloud Controller Manager code out, and they're planning on having something to that degree done in 1.10, which gives me hope that they're actually working on this. Because in the past, when I've talked to him about it, he said it sounds really interesting and it sounds like the great path forward, but is not, at the top of their list. So I'm hoping that we have sort of a carrot there in the sense that it makes it easier for him to actually split the code apart, and that's an incentive to actually build it during this release cycle. But I do think, like as you're saying, Tim, if somebody wants to step in and help, that would be a great place where I'm sure Walter would love to have other people help with that code and help with that migration process. So third on the list, I put kubeadm to GA. I had this as a P0, but after our last discussion, I downgraded it to a P1 and marked some of the sub items as P0 because I think we talked about bootstrap tokens to GA. We expect that to land. The work that Lee's doing on securing the etcd endpoint with TLS, we expect that to land. Assuming that dynamic kubelet configuration lands, I believe we can get the drop-in generic stuff finished. And that sort of leaves and I put the survey on there, right? So sending out a survey to figure out from our users exactly what they're expecting. And if we can get all that stuff done, then we have, a small chance of getting to GA in 1.10. Otherwise, I think we're set up pretty well, depending on the results of the survey, to get there in 1.11, in sort of the second, right at the midpoint of this year. I also put documentation on there. I think, as Joe mentioned earlier, we need to view documentation as part of that GA process. And a lot of the things that we expect people to do with kubeadmin, we just need to make it really clear in our documentation, how you do these tasks, right? So we shouldn't rely on the built-in help when you run kubeadmin help upgrade to tell users how to run upgrades, for instance. We should actually have some good documentation around that. Everything else in the doc, I've downgraded to P3. I think pretty much everything else is stuff that has very little chance of getting done during this release cycle, unless we have some folks that are stepping up and going to put some significant effort on the remaining tasks. So I'll just breeze through those pretty quickly. One is self-hosting as default. This is something we'd had at the top of the list for the last couple of releases, but with the sort of new focus on GA and the explicit notion that self-hosting would not be the default, I don't think it's worth trying to make that the default as we're trying to push for GA. We should make it work. We should make sure it's sort of beta quality, but we shouldn't make it the default. Next is HA support. I think we should maybe redefine this as documentation of HA support as opposed to trying to build HA into the tool itself. And if we call documentation of HA as a separate line item, I think that would be a P1 or a P0. But actually building the functionality for seamless HA in kubeadmin itself, I think is a pretty low priority at this point. Next one is the push for getting APIs defined. This is obviously copied from last time. It didn't make it into 1.9. I think we're at this point waiting on component config to get a little bit further so that we can use component config to define the cluster configuration itself. Next, we have better test coverage. We got partway through this last quarter. I sort of carried this over to see if there were any other things that people wanted to add in this space this quarter, or if this is something we should drop because we feel like we have better test coverage for the features that already exist. All right, I'll leave it in there as P3. Next is to improve the release process. The last update in December was Lucas said we're waiting for Basil. And Tim, I know you had some specific thoughts about what this would look like. Do you think any of
I
this
don't know.
should be related to the GA push, or is this sort of separable?
I want to know, I need to talk with Jeff Grafton about what the state is of Basil builds. It would make life a lot more seamless if we could just build from root and have that all of the artifacts tested as part of every single test. That would be super duper. But that was not the state of things for a long time. So let me poke him and follow up to see where we're at. But I know the code is there, the bits are there, but we were still waiting on the cross-platform build capabilities. I don't think that should really hold us up. Because are the tests even running on like other architectures?
Does kubeadm build for Mac OS, or is it just Linux?
It builds for, I think the artifacts for upstream there's a bunch of weird server architectures because IBM, and then there's a ARM and x86. Yeah. So I think the biggest ones were x86 and ARM, and the ARM support was still not all there.
Yeah, I think unlike Chris, unlike
cross-build's not working yet. So any cross-build platform stuff is not working yet. You still have to use Go build for that. Still limitation of Basil Go rules. We're dealing with that in COPS as well. That's why I can answer it.
Okay, I will say that sort of unlike COPS or kubectl, kubeadm is intended to be running on the machine where you're actually going to also run the kubelet. And since we don't really support running kubelets on Macs, I think having Mac support for kubeadm is not necessarily required.
Right, but you have it for like IBM architecture. Like you release different binaries for kubeadm, correct? For different arcs.
I think we build them. I think if you look at what we actually release, the sort of release is the packages that we build, and those are built.
Right. Right, and my point is that you have different architectures. Cross-build doesn't work yet. Only works with Go, not Basil yet.
So Tim, if you could follow up and fill in any more details there, so that as we're going forward, we can track what we'd like to do with the release process, or link to some issues in the backlog. That would be really useful. Next is add-on management. So this was a pretty contentious topic at the contributor summit. I think our goal for 2018 needs to be to figure out what add-on management means, and that's something we should probably get started on now in terms of sort of like the kubeadm GA, maybe sort of trying to maybe send out surveys or pull together the primary stakeholders and just start getting some consensus on what add-ons are before we start trying to build a solution to manage them. And finally, Lucas had one in here about kubeadm phases and a new API group. I think this overlaps somewhat with the kubeadm alpha beta APIs. And again, I don't see this making a huge amount of progress this release cycle unless someone wants to step up and drive that. So that was the end of the 1.10 doc. Again, there's potentially things that are not in that doc. If there's something you are planning on working on sort of under the auspices of this SIG, it would be great to add it to the doc so we can have visibility on that for everyone.
I'm going to pop in an etcd manager thing I've been poking around with. I'd like to give a demo of that at some stage, and we can see if we want to do it in this SIG or just generally, but see if other people want to contribute as well.
Yeah, I think this week was pretty busy, but next week might be a really good time to do a demo for that.
Or 2 weeks, but yeah.
Or 2 weeks, sure. Whenever you'd like.
Thank you.
All right, we're pretty much out of time. Thank you, everyone. We'll see people maybe tomorrow, and if not, next Tuesday. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.